Okay, welcome everybody to Lawrence Heritage State Park, to the lunchtime presentations. I'm Rich, the summer interpreter here. You all know me, and welcome. And today, I just want to bring a couple of things to your attention before we get started. A couple of things coming up. We have the flyers downstairs on the first floor, but Tuesday coming up next week is the 17th annual old-fashioned 4th of July celebration here. You're all welcome to come. All the information is downstairs on the pink flyers, okay? So if you don't have any other plans for next Tuesday during the daytime, you're all welcome to attend our annual celebration here, okay? And then also downstairs, we have the July flyer for the lunchtime presentations. I'll be getting us started a week from today. I'll be talking about the mighty Merrimack. So I'll give a presentation about the Merrimack River, give you some interesting information there. We'll have our usual multiple choice quiz, okay? We'll have some laughs, and we'll learn a lot at the same time as well, okay? And then after on the 12th, the 19th, and the 26th, you can see the other topics and presenters here, okay? So you can help yourself to the flyers downstairs. And again, also, of course, help yourself to the refreshments. We do have cold water. I'll bring that up in a moment. Today, we have Sarah White here, who is also employed, like I am, by the Department of Conservation and Recreation, and she is the Director of Climate Resilience, right, for DCR. And I heard her speak last week. We had orientation last week, and it was very interesting. I learned a lot, and I'm sure you'll find it for a presentation today interesting as well. I'm sure you'll also learn a lot, okay? So I'll turn it over to Sarah now.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Yeah, great. And thanks for the compliments from last week. And you'll notice that I'm going to show some of the same pictures that you saw.
Yeah, okay.
But this presentation is a little bit different.
Yeah,
so
okay.
you'll maybe learn some new things.
Yeah, good. That's always good. Okay.
Great.
All right, good.
Well, thank you for joining me today. And my hope for this talk is to really talk to you a little bit about what DCR as an agency statewide is doing about our efforts related to climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And I'm going to discuss those two terms and get into a little bit about how we think about both of those aspects, and then give you several examples of ways in which we're sort of already starting to work on things, and give plenty of time for questions and discussion and thoughts that you have as well. So I think what I'll do is just jump into a few slides, and then I'll take pauses throughout and see if people have any thoughts or comments or anything like that. Does that sound like a good plan? All right, excellent. So as was introduced, my name is Sarah White, and I'm the Director of Climate Resilience for DCR. And what that position means, basically, is that I get to work across all of the properties that we own and manage that are under our stewardship at DCR, and making sure that we're thinking about ways that not only will climate impacts, so sort of thinking about weather and sort of changes in our environment are affecting the resources that we steward, but also how can we make sure that we're not contributing additionally to the negative impacts of greenhouse gas emissions through our operations, through our buildings. What could we be doing to be part of the solution as well? So it's sort of both things. And I just show here on the slide that this is the official sort of definition of climate change that you would find in the statewide climate hazard mitigation plan that the Commonwealth produces as a statewide document. In fact, they're updating it right now. So we were a part of that update since we manage so many properties across the state, but there was participation from all the state agencies as well as some of our nonprofit partners and municipalities as well, because we all sort of live here together. And this is just a picture of me out in one of our properties in Western Mass after a pretty significant rainstorm that we had. And, you know, one of the interesting things that we'll talk about is how climate impacts are already really affecting, and we're starting to see changes in the way that storms that we've We've always had sort of summer, July rainstorms, but we're seeing an intensity, a greater intensity of precipitation and wind associated with these storms. We're seeing more water included in these storms as weather sort of moves across the country. There's more moisture available in these storms, and a lot of that has to do with some of the changes in the atmosphere. And quite frankly, the increase in global temperature allows for more water to be available for storms as they create. So that's kind of why we're seeing such an increase in erosive events. And our infrastructure that we have, even around here, we have gutters on this building, for example, that, pull the rainwater down. It just started to rain as we started this talk. And of course, yes, cue the rain. But these pipes and things are designed to be a certain diameter to carry a certain amount or volume of water away. And what happens when our storms are bigger than that is that's when we start to see these undesirable consequences. Like we might, in this instance, if the water's not being carried away off the roof, you could potentially see some seepage and get leaky roofs. You could have issues with the storm water draining off the road or the sidewalk. It'll drain eventually, but that's where you have issues when the sort of water sits for a while. So we're trying to understand these impacts. So the way that we do this strategically is we look at the different ways that the climate affects weather and how those weather patterns are changing, and thinking about how that's going to continue to change in the future. So I like to talk about it in 4 major buckets or 4 major categories. And those are here on the slide. So it's changes in precipitation, which I just gave you an example. And what that means is overall wetter, on average, weather systems. That is the projection. And we're actually projected to see an increase in winter precipitation, but not in the form of snow, in the form of sort of more mild winter precipitation. And so what can be really problematic is in our developed areas, like in this city, for example, when we have a really cold ground, because it's been January, and it freezes, and everything is frozen, and then all of a sudden, we get this like warm bit, where the ground is still frozen, but then we have rain. Where does that water go? It can't infiltrate into the lawns like it can in the summer. And that, we have these issues with people's basements being flooded that never were flooded before, in parts of the community that are just kind of experiencing these strange occurrences. And again, that all has to do with these changes in precipitation. Sea level rise is another aspect of climate change that we're evaluating, and we're looking at how the average annual sea level is changing and how that's going to impact our coastal properties. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that today because we here are not on the coast, but I'm sure you like to visit the coast often, so especially this time of year when it's almost 80 degrees outside. Rising temperatures is another. So as I mentioned, because of the average temperature, the temperature in the ambient air, depending on where it is in the air column, actually impacts weather. Can impact it negatively and positively depending on what you're hoping to have for that particular day. And so one of the things we're particularly concerned about temperature really, is how it's going to affect our plant and vegetation in our forests particularly. Because many of our tree species are used to or accustomed to living in a particular average temperature, particularly in the cooler sort of shoulder months. And so as those averages change over time, it causes those species to not be as thriving. And it makes them susceptible to pests, fungus, disease, and then we see a decline in the health of those trees. So just like people, when we're tired or thirsty or hot, we're more susceptible than we are on a day where we're feeling really strong and hydrated. And the trees are no different. And so with that constant sort of pressure of change in temperature, it's something we need to be concerned about and something our foresters are really monitoring quite closely. And then the last thing I'll mention is extreme weather, which we talked about a little bit in terms of more rain in a storm. But we certainly are seeing a lot more energy in our storms, and that has to do with, again, that heat differential. That's what makes us really concerned about hurricanes and things like that being more severe than we've experienced in many, many decades. I don't expect you to be able to read any of the words on the slide because they're so miniature, but what I will tell you is the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan looks at all the weather, those different sectors that I just talked about, and they break it down by kind of 5 major areas of things that we care about. So human sector, which is like people's health and safety; infrastructure, which is like our buildings, roads, bridges, hospitals; natural environment, which is really core to DCR's focus; governance, which is how the state government and federal government will work together to respond; and then economy. So, and economy kind of layers through all of those things. And we sort of really focus on the areas of kind of the nearest concern. What do we need to be dealing with? And so DCR has taken this approach since our office was created to think about all of those sectors and how those overlap with what DCR does, right? And so we have many buildings. We're sitting in one right now. This is a historic structure, which is especially complicated for us to maintain because it's got good bones, but you have to maintain and make upgrades over time. We need to reduce our overall consumption of fuel and electricity to be more of a conservation leader. And we have to make sure that we're also following state guidelines and executive orders. And so we have some in place, which I'll talk about in a minute, about all the things that we're doing to make sure that we're following this sort of climate mitigation, which is reducing our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions from burning fuels and so forth. And then we already talked a little bit about some of the techniques for managing those impacts from climate, so things like upgrading our stormwater capabilities to be able to move rainwater away after a storm and things like that. And I'm sure next week, when you talk about the Merrimack River, you'll talk a lot about flooding. Yes. And some of the things that I'm sure have been done over the years to sort of try to keep the river at bay, whether it be structural flood walls along the riverside or different types of techniques. So I won't steal your thunder on that for next week. So as I did mention, the state has many requirements. Some of them are new, some of them are older, that have been around for a number of decades, and that we're just following to make sure that we're, as an agency, leading by example. We know that we work really closely with many of the cities and towns, and they look to us, as one of the largest landscaping organizations in the Commonwealth. How much grass do we mow? How many trees do we trim? How many buildings, historic properties do we steward? And so we really want to embrace the requirements, because we're required to, whether we like it or not, but we do like it, and we really think that leading by example is a really important part of DCR's mission to bring information to our visitors so that they can kind of see and understand what is all happening. So if you're ever so interested, I'm referencing those requirements, those executive orders. So I'm just going to pause here because I covered a lot, and I just wanted to see if there's any specific questions or anything before I start to talk about decarbonization and greenhouse gases a little bit more. Yeah?
The reason we don't have any, is it the emissions this year, the elevator? To do with the weather this winter?
That's a really good question, and I'm not entirely sure, but I did have a conversation with somebody about that very thing, and their guess was because we had a really late freeze that many of the buds on those, but also other plants, they didn't survive. So I wonder if that's what happened. And is that climate? I don't know. Weather's weird. I'm sure that you remember, in your childhood having which was a few minutes ago, maybe, right? And you might have had strange occurrences. So there's, weather sort of is in patterns, but climate is sort of that 30-year or greater average. So when we talk about climate, we're not talking about, it's a bad climate day because it's raining. We're talking about the average of all of this data and information over a period of a minimum of 30 to 40 years, and then compounding that over many more years. In fact, in Massachusetts, we have one of the longest weather stations in the United States, which is at one of our DCR properties, the Blue Hills Weather Observatory, which has over 100 years of this weather data that they've been collecting at that particular site. And there's more, but that's just one we're particularly proud of. And, it's really like looking at over 100 or plus years worth of average information before you can draw conclusions on what's just sort of a freak cold day snap that's going to kill the forsythia bushes, or something that's really like a projection for the future. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you find that you see examples of trees adapting to climate change?
Yes, so a healthy tree is a resilient tree. And so that's something that we like to try to promote in our forestry practices, is making sure that we are facilitating the healthiest and most resilient forests possible. But there are certain species of trees that prefer colder weather. And so as the weather warms, and one species that I can think of off the top of my head, but I am, let me just say, not a tree expert, so like don't take this to the bank, but hemlock is one, where hemlock occurs at higher elevations and it's at the higher northern range for Massachusetts anyways, and we're starting to see a decrease in the, not the number of trees, but just their prevalence in terms of how strong and healthy and tall they can grow, for example, because they're happier like in Vermont and Canada at this point because of, again, the temperature. You wouldn't see one in Florida, for example. And then what we are witnessing is that increase in sort of those southern species or those warmer species doing better here than they probably could, 50 years ago. For example, you may be able to, when you look at the gardening zones, like if you're familiar with that, and you split zone 1, 2, 3, I think we're at about 7, 8-ish, depending on where you are in Massachusetts, but those times of years where it's okay to plant a bulb, for example, like those averages are going to shift a little bit. I'm sure they've shifted in your lifetime in some ways.
I have one more question. You mentioned the executive orders.
Yes.
Are those executive orders coming down the pipe?
Yes, they are. So the last executive order related to climate that is relevant to us was signed by Governor Healy. I think it was her very first executive order when she became governor, which was to establish a statewide climate office, a climate chief. And so that position and the authorities therein is new to the Commonwealth, and it's kind of similar to my position at DCR, which is I'm meant to work across all of DCR, between forestry and the park operations, whether they be urban parks or our forested parks in the west, our flood control operations, our traffic operations on the parkways. We have a lot of different types of things within DCR. And so that's one. And then there's one specific to decarbonizing, which I'll talk about in a second. That's Executive Order 594. And that requires the state government agencies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Has very specific targets, which I'll go into.
Now, is the state legislature doing anything? Are they involved in what's
They are definitely involved, and there's a few different acts that have been passed by the legislature, which I can't remember off the top of my head the exact title, but they're really working all together to do a lot of the same. They have a lot of the same goals. And so a lot of the legislative action has been around being able to provide funding for very specific aspects related to some of the things we're going to see here. And you'll see that, and you'll see the support from your local and state and federal delegation really trying to support these initiatives through funding. Yeah.
When you get to the end-use fuel switching, not now, but I do have a Prius and I do drive a Prius.
Yeah.
Could you briefly try to explain the makings of battery?
So I am not a lithium-ion battery person. I'm not going to talk about that because that is not my space. But I will acknowledge that there are concerns about the source material for many products that we use, and batteries is definitely one of them. As I sit here right now, I have a lithium-ion battery in my laptop, in my cellular phone, and in our vehicles and in other applications. And so I'm aware that I certainly read, the studies as well. But
to prove to the gas car driving people that my car is better than
yeah.
thinking about the battery.
Yeah, there's always trade-offs, right, in every decision that we make, and so we're really having to discover what those are in a lot of these new initiatives that we're trying to take on. And I think one of the great things that DCR is doing, so I'll skip past this because you saw for a few minutes, but I'd talk a little bit about what we're doing about greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and really, quite frankly, trying to mitigate our carbon footprint across our agency. We're trying to ensure that we're protecting our facilities, obviously, so that places like this are available and continue to be thriving. Reducing our energy is one way to reduce emissions. So in Massachusetts, the majority at this moment of our electricity is produced by natural gas. As you are aware, there's many projects like offshore wind, which is going to bring more clean, renewable energy in to our state. But at this moment, as we sit in this room with electricity right now, so what do? We try to conserve, right? We try to conserve because it's cost effective. The lower our electric bills, the better for everybody, because, you know, the taxpayers pay for our electric bill. But also the less energy we're using, the less carbon that we're emitting through that source, right? So if that makes sense. So we're trying to trace it back. Also other sustainable activities, which I'll talk about in a minute, and I'll show you some pictures, because I've been doing a lot of talking. So let me talk a little bit about some of the things that we're working on. So we're working on optimizing building performance. What does that mean exactly? So in a building like this, when you look around, think about how difficult it is to heat a room of this size, right? And so we try to do and bring in different technology to make sure that our heating systems are super efficient, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to be using electric heat to heat a room like this if all it's doing is just blowing heat right out the window, right? So we try to make our buildings optimized so that they're being able to contain heat or cooling. I don't know if we have air conditioning in this building, but some do. And so we just want to make sure that the building is efficient, right? And then the other things that we're working on is, again, those energy conservation measures. So I know this drives people bananas sometimes, but it's actually really good for our overall electricity use. So we've installed in this building, but in others across our system, what they call automatic sensors for lighting, for example, so that when you leave the room and there's no motion in the room for a period of time, all the lights shut down. And then when you walk back in, the lights turn back on. The restrooms have them up here, for example. And what that allows to do is it just takes the human think out of it. I mean, if any of you have children or had children living in your home at any point, and I know that I was guilty of this when I was younger, and now I see myself doing this because I'm a parent. It's like, shut the light when you leave your bedroom, shut the light when you leave the kitchen. I go downstairs and every light is on and nobody is even home. Everyone's outside. It's like, why are you doing this? So it's things like that. If we can take the human decision part out of it, it just helps. It's all these incremental things. It's things you can do at home too, like that as well. One of the other major areas is we're trying to reduce our fossil fuel consumption in our heating and cooling. This is one of the largest sources for DCR's greenhouse gas emissions. We own more buildings than any other state agency in Massachusetts, by more than double. Many of our properties have multiple buildings on them. Many of our buildings are very old, and they're not super energy efficient, or they might have an older heating system that's not super efficient. And so what we're trying to do is strategically working first in environmental justice communities where there's already a disproportionate impact on populations where, whether it be air quality or temperature or what have you, trying to reduce or eliminate these fossil fuels in our facilities and install either the best, most efficient system, even if it's still a fossil fuel system, but we're really trying to get off of gas and propane and diesel fuel, also called number 2 heating oil, and put in efficient electric air source heat pumps to be able to support heating and cooling in our facilities. I just wanted to show you here an example of one of our brand new buildings. So some of our buildings are new, and this particular building that I'm showing you in a photo is called North Point Maintenance Center, and basically it's a maintenance garage with some offices and conference space. It's in Cambridge, and this building was built about 3 years ago, and this is what's called a LEED certified building. So this building was built to be super energy efficient. It is what they call a net zero building. So it means it actually uses less energy than it produces, and so it's sort of like a net positive. type of a facility. So it's got electric, heat, and heat pump technology. This particular building recycles its water and does not have additional water usage beyond sort of whatever the averages are. It has electric vehicle charging stations so that as we bring more electric vehicles online, they're ready to go. This particular facility has a wash station for our equipment, because of course we have to wash the road salt off of it to make sure that we can keep our equipment nice for many years. And that water sort of gets treated and recycled in the wash bay, for example. So we don't have a lot of those types of buildings, but when we do get funding to build new buildings, you'll be sure that we'll be making sure they're designed to the best standard available. And we are in the process of doing a fleet conversion. So electrifying our fleet is a requirement of State Executive Order 594, as we were just mentioning. And so where and when it's appropriate and when the market has available conversion vehicles where we can bring online. So the agency does have a couple of Park Ranger vehicles that are fully plug-in electric. And we're evaluating how we convert some of the other vehicles across the state. So we're not going out and just spending a ton of money on buying all brand new vehicles. We're looking at a strategic process as we retire a vehicle. What do we buy and replace, and how does that work? So it's a little bit slow. It's not like we're gonna, like Amazon, I think you've maybe seen, is going out and buying like 1,000 new vans every week, and we're not doing that. We're being a little more strategic and budget conscious as we kind of work through that, but it's definitely something that we're working towards. And as such, we're making sure that we have the electric vehicle charging stations to support those. And I wanted to show you this map because it kind of looks, my husband, when I showed him this, he said, that looks like a fire. And I said, it's not a fire, but it is called a heat map. And so, what I wanted to do when I was telling you about how do we decide where electric vehicle charging stations should go, we use data and information to tell us where they should go. So what this is a map that we developed that looks at each one of our vehicles that we own, that DCR owns statewide, has a GPS unit inside, sort of like a cell phone, how you can track where it's located. And all of our vehicles have these GPS units. And it tracks all kinds of stuff, like the number of miles the vehicle drove in a day, or how fast it went on the highway, or where it parked overnight. And that's the information I want to know, because I want to know where these vehicles are parking. That's where I want to put the charging stations. So we looked at a period of data over, I think it was about 3 months, and we were able to map these vehicles. And you can kind of see here, like, there's a little cluster here, like some cars parked there for a couple days, and here for a couple days, and here for a couple days, and there. That's what those yellow circles are. And so we average those together and we see where there's like a big sort of cluster. That's where we're putting these charging stations first. And we're going to do the same exact methodology when we do public charging stations. So we won't be able to see the GPS of where public people park, but we're going to use other technology like aerial maps. And we're going to look at parking lot data, for example, like if we have a parking lot where we charge to park, we know how many cars are in there every day. And so we're going to use information to help us make good decisions that are cost effective and actually meaningful to the community. All right, I'm going long, so I just want to make sure that I have time for discussion as well. So a couple of other things, these are sort of smaller activities, and I say they're smaller because they're addressing impacts from greenhouse gases that are just not quite as big as the vehicle fuels or our building fuels. Those are really big contributors to greenhouse gases. And so if you look at a pie chart, which you saw at the last presentation, almost 90% of all of DCR's greenhouse gas emissions come from our vehicles, our buildings, and what we call sort of other fuels. And that's things like fuel for like generators and equipment and things like that. The 10% of other is from things like this. So things like our water consumption. We can figure out how much emissions, because you have to maybe pump water out of the ground, or you're getting it from a water treatment facility that uses diesel to treat the water. So there's a carbon cost associated with that as well. So we want to make sure that we're using less water, being able to conserve. And so I always like to do, like, you were saying you do quizzes. I like to do quizzes too. In the middle, do you notice something on the floor in that picture? People are always like, is that sink broken? When they look at it, because part of the plumbing is on the floor. Do you see that little piece of pipe? So what that is a picture of is that is a winterized bathroom at one of our parks that we don't open in the winter. And because we're able to disconnect the plumbing and clear the pipes out, we don't have to heat this building in the winter because we winterize it. And so what does that do? That allows us to completely take this building off grid for, 3 months in the dead of winter. Nobody's really, people I'm sure would love that are winter hiking to have a restroom to use. But this particular park is more of a beach swimming area, and it's just not really commonly used. So it's a great way for us to be able to, with a simple approach, we just go in, we take the sinks apart, we drain the water, close the building down, secure it for the winter, reopen it in our busiest season. And then it really reduces our emissions over the winter time. The other picture I wanted to show you is this sort of light colored pavement. So what this actually is an asphalt parking lot, a blacktop parking lot, where there is an epoxy resin painted on top of it to make the entire parking lot a light color. Because as you know, heat absorbs into darker colors more and holds there. So the asphalt actually can be about 15 degrees warmer to the touch on a hot day than it is now with this light colored pavement. So this was a pilot project. We tried this in one of our parking lots at one of our pools. And if any of you have ever been to one of our pools, or really any public pool in the summertime, there's a lot of kids running around, and usually you've got a mom with like 3 to 12 children and one adult, and you're trying to sort of wrangle, and you always have this like slippery 3-year-old who doesn't want to put their shoes on, and it's time to go, and you're running to the parking lot, and boom, are their feet really hot? So at a minimum, this is like creature comfort because the pavement is cooler. It's just quite lovely. But it's also in general, we're bringing down that temperature in that area. So the whole parking lot is cooler. It doesn't have that urban heat island effect. So we're gonna try to pilot this in some of our campgrounds and other places where people are really interacting with the pavement a lot, either on a bike path or in a parking lot or a campground, to really try to see if we can bring down that temperature. So I just wanted to show you that. And we had to paint the lines blue. And we chose the blue because we thought it was easier to see on the white. Usually parking lot lines are white. And then also we thought blue would be nice because it sort of goes with the fact that it's a pool and you have that cool summer vibe. So that's what that photo is about. Our natural working land, so as maybe many of you have heard, trees and vegetation, whether it be salt marsh grasses or gardens or meadows, absorb carbon. So as we put carbon out into the atmosphere from our tailpipe emissions, for example, trees that are growing, they need carbon to be able to use for photosynthesis. So it's this sort of cycle, which is great. To some degree, our forests and our landscapes can sequester, store, and buy down that carbon. So that is something that we're always looking to do, is to expand our forested lands by land acquisition or buying more property where we can, and making sure what we have as forest or what we have as grassland or marshland stays that way, so it doesn't get developed into something different. And so that's a big part of our land protection aspect of our agency as well. And then the picture with the butterfly, I just want to share a little story. So about 12 years ago, this particular property where I took that photo, was a residential property. It's part of, what town is it? It's in southeastern Massachusetts. I forget the exact name of the town, but it was about 12 acres of land, and when the homeowner, when he passed away, he had directed his children to donate the land to the state, and they did. And one of the really cool things was at the back end of the property was this abandoned rail bed one of the kind of defunct rail lines. And so we were able to actually work together to include the rail line as well as the actual residential property. It has a small house and parking and whatnot, like a field area. And we're making it into a brand new state park. So it's gonna have about a 1.5-mile rail trail where people can bring their bikes, it'll be paved back there. And then there's a little visitor center out front, a lawn where people can picnic. And it's access to a beautiful part of the Taunton River. But one of the really neat things is like that area could have been developed by any kind of use, right? But now we're gonna protect it permanently as sort of wetland and meadow, which is where this is, and there's some forested parts of it. So that's just a really neat little story.
Is that Dayton, Mass?
I think it is in Dayton. Yeah, you're right. It's across the river from Dayton Rock State Park. Like almost, you can almost see it. Yeah. All right. So a couple more bits and pieces. So renewable energy is a really important way for us to reduce grid electricity carbon. And so we are, where appropriate, investigating renewable energy through solar. This is one area that we've started to invest some infrastructure in. So what I'm showing you here is 2 of our solar arrays that we have on DCR property. One of them is on top of an ice rink that also has a swimming pool in the summertime. This was installed last year. This is its first full summer in operation, and I will tell you that in the summer, while this building uses most of its energy in the winter when the ice is being cooled, because that's just such an energy-intensive exercise, but it does have a lot of use in the summer because it has the pool and the pumps for the pool. Those all run on electricity. There's people in the locker rooms and families and everything. This building is running at a deficit. What does that mean? That means it is producing more electricity off of these solar panels than we can possibly use in a day in the summer. So we're really excited about that. And any of that extra energy goes back into the electrical grid for other people to use. And then the other picture, this one's kind of interesting. So this is in Worcester. If you've ever been to the Worcester, it's on 146. It's a visitor center. We just actually took ownership of it, DCR did, within the last about 6 months or so. The property was owned by the Mass Department of Transportation. And so DCR is taking it on. And these panels, as you can see, are see-through. Do you see how you can almost see the blue sky behind them? So it's nice because even though you're sort of under a solar panel, you don't feel like you're under this roof. You can still see through them. You can see the blue sky, but it is a little bit of shade. We have picnic tables under here. So it's a really nice place right in the city. It's covered. So you can have a picnic in the middle of the day. And meanwhile, it's producing electricity for the building. All the things I just talked about, our carbon and sort of how much emissions and everything else, we track this through a bunch of data dashboards. And again, our goal at the end of the day for all of this is to reduce our energy use. I don't have a specific number by. I tell the staff and I tell our leaders, let's just use less. If we can work on a little bit less each year, we're doing good. We do have big targets that are set for us by those executive orders, but you know, there's only so much a person can do in a day, right? So. And I've already given you a whole bunch of information about some of these aspects of projects that we've already started to work on, but I want to give you some statistics because sometimes that's really exciting and sometimes statistics are really boring. So if you're one of those people who thinks statistics is boring, just hang on for 2 slides and I'll get through it. But in terms of upgrading our energy, so you know, as you know, there's sort of new technology with digital LED lighting, and we've been able to convert 6,332 street and outdoor lights to LED lights over the last couple of years, which reduces approximately 1,000 metric tons of greenhouse gas contribution. That's just in light bulbs. It's pretty amazing. We still have more work to do. That's just some of the light bulbs, but it's a really good amount. And we do track where we're doing those swap outs. We've made some electric upgrades as well and some building envelope upgrades as we were talking about, so making sure that buildings are really energy efficient. At 209 sites, And some of these are small things, like for example, putting some insulation around windows. These are actually really nice windows because these are new. But in some buildings where we have older windows and we maybe don't have the money to replace the full window, but we can do some insulation around the edges or things like that. So we capture all those smaller incremental upgrades. I talked about the water upgrades. You have sort of those touchless faucets. So those were great during COVID because you didn't have to touch them with all the germs and everything, but also it allows for the water to turn on and off when you're not using it so people don't leave it on accidentally. So that saves water over time. We talked about our conversion to battery-powered vehicles and so forth, and really trying to promote fields and meadows and things of that nature. Additionally, we have been really successful. This is another picture of that North Point facility in Cambridge from a different angle. This is that brand new building. And then, we've done some additional retrofits for facilities like at Shannon Beach, which is also in Cambridge, I think. The Worcester Visitor Center, which has that see-through solar canopy, is another building that we're really proud of. We talked about those solar panels. We have solar panels at 10 of our facilities statewide at this moment. And those are listed here at the bottom of the screen as well. So that's kind of the summary of all the things that we've got going on, all the details, and I, with all that information, hope that if you have questions, we can talk about them now. What do you think?
I got a question regarding the asphalt. I've never seen anything like that before.
Let me go back to the picture.
But I just, I think that's a great idea, and it makes sense, but I'm surprised that this is the first time I'm seeing something like that. Such a great idea.
Yeah, so have you ever been to Florida and you might notice like in the South, most of the, like for example, roads or highways even are made with like a concrete aggregate that's white already. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the heat in Florida, I'm using Florida as an example, that's where my parents live, so I'm familiar with it, but anywhere down south really. That's how roads are made, because when the materials are tested to withstand their weather, their average weather, that's what's most appropriate. Here in Massachusetts, and we actually do have a materials testing lab at DCR, where we test all of the concrete and aggregate that we use in our landscapes and in our roads to make sure that they're of high quality and they meet certain regulatory standards that we have to make sure that we meet. It's appropriate for us to use blacktop aggregate. It's cheaper than concrete, and it's what's most commonly used in this part of the country. But as our temperature sort of changes and we see more days in the summer above 90 degrees consecutively, where the evenings do not get cool enough to really reduce that temperature on the asphalt, you can see that blacktop becoming up to 120 degrees to the touch.
So is this stuff, it's an epoxy?
It is.
It's a coating.
Yeah.
So, what about the porousness of
Yeah.
is it something that you can't revert it, once you have blacktop, you can't make it porous, you have to remove it and then put something else?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So a typical asphalt parking lot is not porous.
Right.
It typically, when you have a blacktop parking lot, you would treat the stormwater, or you would manage the water that falls onto it. It can't seep through like it can in a grassy area, or even like a sidewalk where you might have paving stones where water can seep in between. So it doesn't really do anything negatively, because asphalt already doesn't do anything with stormwater. But one of the things that it can do is it can reduce that sort of ambient temperature. It also is cooler to the touch for people. And you can order it in a bunch of different colors. So here, this is called sandstone. But there might be places where we would tint it a little bit more like the color of the drapes in here, because maybe a white would be too aggressive on the reflection. And so we have a vendor that we use. There's a lot of different products on the market. I don't know the brand name of this particular resin, but many of the companies that do asphalt driveways could also add this on top. I mean, it's expensive, just like many things are. And so we want to be really strategic about where we put it. The other thing that we're really interested about is how it's going to stand up to plowing. So we do plow this parking lot in the winter because it's really close to a senior center. And so we like to leave the parking lot open in case there's overflow parking from that senior center. It's also used as like a turnaround for vans and things in the wintertime. So we plow the parking lot, and it stood up really well. The person who is responsible for plowing here is one of our staff, and so we talked about taking pictures in the fall and then take some pictures in the spring and see, like, did the plow, cause any divots, and a few, but nothing substantial. So we hope to get several years out of this before we have to. A typical asphalt parking lot, depending on its use, has a return interval. I don't know exactly what it is off the top of my head, but you have to go in and sort of do a surface coating anyway every number of years. And so we just hope that the coating is durable enough to last so that we don't have to do this more often than we would the regular resurfacing. So we'll see. Yeah.
In the future, like driveways
Yeah.
in your newer buildings, aren't there more energy efficient ways other than asphalt to put on the driveways and allow seepage of rainwater? And is that more cost-wise or not? And what are the other ways?
Yeah, so one of the things I think you're talking about is being able to allow stormwater to kind of infiltrate through a hard surface like a parking lot. And there absolutely is. We use many of those across the DCR system. Permeable pavement is a technology that is really, really great. It's more costly, and it's more costly to maintain because you need to basically vacuum the sediments and sand out from it so that it works. It gets clogged. Like, if you think of a sponge, right, that's sitting in your sink, it's got all the holes and sort of, right? But if you drove a car over a sponge for a period of time, it's going to get dirty. And so it creates this sort of layer of like fine-grained sediment, and then the water can't go through it anymore. So there's these special vacuum trucks that are created to suck the sand out. And it's like vacuuming. You just have to kind of go over it and vacuum it and maintain it. And that needs to be done at least every year, depending on where it is. For example, if we were doing this somewhere like at the beach where there's just a lot of sand blowing around in the wind, we'd have to do it even more frequently.
I was thinking more like when you, on something new, digging deep enough where you can fill it with stone and put the top part brick.
Right, and so there's room for the water to be held after a big rainstorm. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember something I was told.
Yeah, that's definitely.
Many, many years ago.
Yeah,
I had a
yeah.
driveway and I used the hot top, and so right now it's just dirt.
Yeah.
And we need to get the right company to do something that's more good for Mother Nature.
Right, and there is definitely ways that you can add drainage, whether it be through what you're describing, which is more of a natural system, which is great if your site can handle it, and it depends on what type of traffic you have on top of it. So something like that would be great for a driveway where it's just a regular size vehicle. But in a parking lot, like a DCR parking lot, where you might have a big dump truck or trash truck that has to come in, those are very, very heavy machines. We need to make sure that what's underneath can support that weight. And so we might engineer a solution that's more of a tank, for example, to hold stormwater in like a cistern underneath the ground. And in urban areas where there really isn't a lot of place for water to go, those are really great options for that. I'm not sure if we have any cisterns. I do know that we're looking to work with the city of Somerville, right near Foss Park, which is one of our sites, and they're looking to do something very similar to what you're describing, which is like an infiltration through kind of like pavers on the sidewalk. They want to be able to create areas for, they're called tree boxes, but they're essentially like where there's holes in the sidewalk where it's just dirt and the tree is there. It helps to A, have some trees in an urban area, but B, the water can actually infiltrate into the ground that way as well. So.
And you use rain barrels on a lot of these?
We have a bunch of facilities that use rain barrels, yeah, especially where we have pollinator gardens. It's a great companion. So I can't say every site has them, but we do have some, and I think that's a great way if it works. And it's something I see a lot more in homes as well. having those with little sort of hose spout at the end.
Sarah, I know people sometimes use the words weather and climate interchangeably, but they don't mean the same thing, right?
They don't. So when we think about weather,
Yes.
weather is like kind of the short-term atmospheric condition that we're in. And so typically, weather is like, 7 days, 10 days, that's weather.
Yeah.
And you'll have whatever it is, you'll have sun, you'll have temperature, you'll have rain, those attributes, those variables.
All in one day.
All in one day, yeah, all in an hour. Here, it's for those that are watching this video playback, it was raining when we started the talk, it is dry now. Or no, it's still raining a little, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those weird, we're in this really wet pattern where every day we have a little bit of rain, but it's really good for the gardens because you remember this time last year, everything was super dry, so this is kind of good. But climate is a little different in that it's the longer term observational averages. So when we think about being able to make a conclusion statistically about climate, 30 years is like the minimum amount of time you would want to evaluate before you said, we're seeing a change, right? 30 years is really the minimum. And when we talk about global climate models and trying to predict the future, it's difficult because none of us really can predict the future, but we have really good models that can project based on historical records for the last 150 years, which we have across the entire globe, where we've collected this atmospheric weather information like temperature and moisture content and things like that. And then we can use all that information, and with machine learning, they project what it'll look like in the future and some of those trends. And then we sort of zoom in on Massachusetts and see how that affects us. And then we look at how our plant life and our animals will respond to those slight changes. And many species are fine, they're adaptable, right? A little bit warmer, they'll be good, but some species are just right on the edge of where is comfortable for them. And so those are those indicator species, we call them. Sometimes people will call that the canary in the coal mine, right? Where you have, that phrase where you send a bird in and see if the gases are too strong, and then if the bird dies, don't send a person down there. People say canary in the coal mine to talk about climate change species because there's some species that are living right way on the edge of their habitat range, right? And so if they're starting to see a decline in those populations of those particular animals, and so one example that I can give you is the salt marsh sparrow, which I can't believe I don't have a picture of a salt marsh sparrow in this slide. It's one of my favorite birds. There are these little shorebirds that basically they're endemic to New England. You can find them in other places, but this is really where they live. And they're in rapid decline. We've lost 80% of the entire global population of salt marsh sparrow in the last 15 or so years. They just can't live. And the biggest challenge that they have is that they nest, they're ground nesting birds. So they make their little nest in grass, and not just any grass, a very specific type of salt marsh grass. And it can't be too wet, and it can't be too dry. And what happens in salt marshes, as you know, if you've been to the beach recently, you see a marsh, it floods twice a day, right? The tide comes in, the grass gets wet, the tide goes out. And in that daily change, they're fine, because in fact they have wings and they can just fly around. And their nests are fine because they pile up a little bit of grass, sort of they make this little grass mound, and they put their eggs in this little nest on the top of the grass mound right at the point where it just gets wet on the bottom and goes away. It's amazing. They're so fickle, these little birds. So in our salt marshes, where we're seeing a real big shift in sort of those tide ranges, not only do the birds have to sort of move their nest back, which they don't like to do because they're kind of not that agile, but also the grass itself is not surviving those extreme changes. And so what we're seeing is a particular manifestation called marsh dieback. You might have heard that word, where basically the normal vegetation that lives in a salt marsh is not surviving because it's too salty. It's getting too much seawater, and it's not experiencing that daily change as much as it used to. So the bird's habitat is shrinking significantly. So that's their big cause. And then of course, like, you know, human interaction. So in certain places, they try to nest too close to where, you know, people want to hike or walk or have pets or, you know, sort of some of that. So that's our canary in the coal mine species for sea level rise, particularly in our salt marshes in the greater Boston area. So we track them really closely and try to monitor their habitat. And where we can, we would love to try to do some things to like help them build their little like nest platforms a little bit, but they're just such finicky little creatures. So I fear that in my lifetime, these birds will be extinct. And I'm not sure there's much we can do for the salt marsh sparrow, but we're gonna try. They're really cute. If you ever get a chance to see, they're like these silly little tiny, they're just so cute. Yeah.
Personal thoughts on styrofoam.
Oh, okay. My personal thoughts on styrofoam? Well, that's a great question. So, I don't know a lot about styrofoam, personally, but what I will tell you that I do in my own home, in my own practices, I use a lot of reusable products, like whether it be a PVA-free water bottle or glass water bottle for things like that. I know that there's many bans on styrofoam, particularly, you know, municipalities can select to reduce or eliminate single-use styrofoam in like restaurants, for example, and I do see that across the state. So trying to sort of reduce that type of thing, but it's not just styrofoam, right? So everything in moderation, and but also it's that cycle. It's like how it's produced, how, you know, how it can break down over time is really the concern. I think regardless of the material, the best thing we can do is try to reuse, you know, personal drinking bottles and coffee cups and things like that the best we can. But, you know, we all just came out of a pandemic where everything was like single wrapped and double wrapped, and we had to do that because we needed to try to preserve our health as best we can. So, you know, there's a balance, right, between a lot of those types of things. Yeah. What else?
Any other questions?
Yeah. Really great thoughts.
My last one.
Yeah.
Plastic bags.
What is it?
Plastic bags.
I think it's the same. You know, I would say the same as I do for any kind of trash, right? It's difficult because the waste stream is something like you can't really control, like packaging of materials and supplies, and you know, so there's a lot of stuff that.
It amazes me when I go to the meat counter and look at the
Yeah.
packaging and like, I can't recycle any of this.
Yeah, recycling is a really huge challenge, and it's something that we as an agency, you know, it's difficult because we have our own trash we produce, right? Like in our offices and in our buildings like this, but then our visitors also. And so DCR has a carry-in, carry-out policy across all of our parks. We do offer trash receptacles at some of our facilities, quite frankly, just so that we don't have a mess of litter, but we always encourage, especially if you're going to one of our fragile environmental areas like a beach or a salt marsh, where we have wildlife really interacting with whatever's left behind on the ground, to always take with you what you took in. And so one of the things that I always have is in my own bag, I keep right here just an empty reusable bag that I can throw in the washing machine, but I can use this as a trash bag if if we all, had these plates, let's say it was a nice day and we were eating on the grass. Hey everyone, we can just throw our trash right in here and take it with us. And then if it's yucky, I can wash it. But I always just fold it up and keep it right in my bag and have one on hand. And honestly, there's all kinds of reasons to have a bag. Like what if you're somewhere and you buy something real quick, or it's like always good to have one. I sometimes collect like leaves or pine cones if I'm somewhere, little things like that. But yeah, so that's one thing that maybe you could do if you have room.
4 dozen in my truck.
Yeah, so it's always
I go
great.
around my church parking lot picking up trash and reusing.
Yeah.
And I used to think it was such an oxymoron that you couldn't recycle plastic bags until I saw how the trash energy plant by Western Engineering, which has the same plant in Pompano Beach on my dad.
Yeah.
When I went there. And I saw a picture of the North plant, like, I know what that is, because the plastic bags clog the machines, and it's so hard for me to tell people
Yeah.
that you please don't put the plastic bags
In the recycling, yeah, there is like, I know at, like the Hannaford's near my house, there's a bag recycling bin where you, for those thin filament, plastics, but yeah, they can't go into the regular recycling, yeah.
That it? Okay, all right, well, thank you.
Well, I